This probably performs well in calf starter grains that have a high percentage crude protein. And if the math is right for feeding this economically, it could fit into your calf starter grains.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Dairy Science Digest. This is a podcast designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to the ears of dairy producers. My name is Reagan Bluel, and I'm from the University of Missouri Dairy Team, and our guest today is Dr. Brown. He's from Kansas State in Manhattan, and he's here to discuss this month's article in press for the Journal of Dairy Science titled The Effects of High Protein Corn co-product as a replacement for soybean meal in your calf starter feed in the post-weaning period. And so I know commodities are a little affordable right now, but we're always looking for ways to substitute different feeds to still meet the dietary demands of all the different phases of life. And so this particular phase is focused in on that post-wean period. And to really understand that in this co-product opportunity, Doc, I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to our
Sure.
listeners.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today, Reagan. And my background is that I have background in dairy cattle nutrition. Did training at Kansas State and Michigan State and University of Wisconsin for my education. And then I've landed back at Kansas State University as an assistant professor here. I have a 60% teaching responsibility. So I teach all of our dairy science classes, which is an honor, as well as a 40% research responsibility as well, and have co-faculty supervisor role for our university dairy farm, which is one of the highest producing herds in the state. So love doing all those things and being involved in our Kansas dairy industry. But you're right on that feed obviously is a big factor for our industry, with it being about 50% of the costs that we would have on a dairy farm at any given point in time. And so you're right, we do need to know what alternative feedstuffs that we can utilize. And so in my PhD program, I had done some research on a high protein corn co-product. It was a downstream product from some different types of ethanol production. And it was about 50% crude protein. And so that's kind of wild to think about it. A 50% crude
Yeah.
protein corn product, that is a really, really concentrated crude protein source that is similar to soybean meal. Yeah, so that kind of piqued my interest. What are these products that are out there that are so high in protein? And there's several different processing techniques that can create those really high protein corn co-products. But because they're novel, we need to understand how they actually feed. And the limited data we have says that they don't always perform exactly like what they do in distillers grains, which is a common feed stuff for us on dairy farms and other livestock operations. We can't just assume that it's going to feed just like
Right.
regular grain that just has more crude protein in it.
For sure. Yeah.
Need to investigate that a little bit more and kind of figure out, does this actually have applicability on a farm and in an animal, and what's the potential return or adjustments we need to make in that situation.
Before we get too far into there, let's talk a little bit about this corn co-product. It's produced by Protomax, and what are kind of the nutrient composition of this particular product, and why did you choose to substitute soybean meal in the rations?
Yeah, good question. So this product was called Protomax. It's from a company called ICM, which is based out of Colwich, Kansas, South Central Kansas. And they've got licensed technologies in a few different places across the United States to produce this. But their process essentially is that they're going to make a high pro distiller's grain. So they're going to fractionate that corn kernel before it goes into the ethanol production process and take off the bran so they can extract more of the starch for ethanol production. It's a higher product for crude protein in that regard and lower fiber because they're taking off that bran. But what's novel about this is that then they have the waste streams that would include the yeast and other liquids in that production process. But they concentrate those yeast bodies down and then add them to those high pro distillers grains. And so what results as a part of that is a crude protein product that's anywhere from 45 to 55% crude protein. The one
Hmm.
we used in our study was about 47% crude protein. It had a starch concentration, obviously, of 8. That's very low,
Hmm.
and probably resistant starches to the fermentation in there. And then the NDF content was about 24%. So a little bit different than what we would see a high pro DDG, but trending along the same lines of higher crude protein and less fiber than what we would typically see in a high pro DDG. The fat concentration ether extract was about 11% as well. So a little bit higher fat at the
Hmm.
same time.
Awesome. Well, and so all of that adds up to a good explanation with soybean meal running right around that 47, 48%. It seems like it'd be a good one-to-one. So let's see the study design. Let's talk a little bit about we've got 42 calves that were post-weaning, as of course the title suggests. They were fed for 4 weeks, three separate treatments with 14 head per treatment. Can you go into what the different treatments were as far as concentrations of this high protein corn coproduct?
Yeah, so great question. So we had three treatments. The first one is a control treatment. And in that treatment, we included soybean meal as the primary protein source in that starter diet. Soybean meal would be kind of the gold standard for what we would include in a calf starter grain currently. It's got a great amino acid profile. It's highly digestible. It's a great product. And obviously, we use a lot of that on dairy farms. And so we included that at about 16.5% of the overall dry matter in that calf starter. And then we gradually replaced that on a one-for-one basis with the high protein corn product. Since they were similar in crude protein, we thought we could make that just one-for-one replacement to see what happens. So we had an intermediate treatment that had a 50% replacement of the soybean meal with the high protein corn co-product, and then a 100% replacement of soybean meal with the high protein corn product. So three treatments in that regard.
Okay, byproducts generated out of the ethanol industry tend to have a reputation of being a little bit low in lysine and methionine. Can you talk a little bit about how your diets address that?
We know the amino acids
Hmm.
concentration of soy and corn is very different.
Absolutely.
And previous studies that have worked to maybe substitute distillers grains for soybean meal have not accounted for that. So one of the key things that we did in this, and so we actually added rumen protected amino acids to make sure that we're making an assessment on the total crude protein or availability differences between these treatments and not inadvertently looking at differences in limiting amino acids that may be different between these treatments.
Sure, completely relevant. And for all those nutritionists out there listening in, I'd encourage you to go to the show notes. They're at the bottom of the page, and you can click on a link to this article and read about those different ingredients and the nutrient composition there on table one. And so, yeah, making sure that those amino acids are met and having the rumen protected or bypass amino acids allows the absorption of that calf to grab it. Now, one thing I want to clarify, when did you start the treatments? Was that at 14 days of life?
Yeah, great question. So we actually started these from about 2 weeks of age and followed them through that about 12 weeks of age. The data from the milk feeding stage wasn't included in this paper, but we just focused on the post-weaning effects when we were without the influence of milk intake and some of those other things that make interpretation a little bit difficult sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so really zooming in on that 8 to 12 week old animal and looking at the data collected there, I like to call those the kindergarten calves, right? And that way we can determine if that starter feed is really having an impact. And so we can't really talk much about performance data without bringing up digestibility differences. And you kind of mentioned a little bit about the fiber, but can we delve right in and talk a lot about that slightly higher NDF? And so that way, when folks are feeding this, they might better understand the implication of that.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that we did on this, like you said, was looking at the digestibility. And we wanted to do that so that we could assess, if we were seeing any growth differences, feed intake differences, why? And is digestibility part of it? And so what we did was we actually collected some fecal samples over the last few days that they were on the study and just tried to estimate using some internal markers what the total tract apparent digestibility was for dry matter and crude protein and starch. And what we actually saw was that the high protein corn product treatments that replaced soybean meal on a contrast basis, they had greater digestibility.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, of both dry matter and crude protein.
Uh-huh.
And we were a little bit floored by this, especially for the crude protein portion, because we had anticipated, we know that zein protein in corn is not necessarily the most digestible
Wait a
protein.
minute, wait a minute. Let's talk about zines,
Yep.
the encapsulation. Yeah, talk about that, please.
Yeah, so zein proteins are the protein that kind of encapsulate the starch granule within a corn kernel. And so they protect that kernel from degradation a lot of times in the rumen. And so that's why when we feed corn, we need to dairy cows, we need to grind it or sile it to help break that down and make it really available. So during the ethanol fermentation process, obviously that starch is going to be removed through
Hmm.
their fermentation process. And what we're left with is the protein
Fraction.
fractions from that plant, which would be the majority of in the zein form and the
Hmm.
different types of zein that are in that product.
Ah, but that rumen is amazing in her ability to unlock, and it's just really impressive. You did see some nice gain, a little over 2 to almost 2.5 pounds during this data collection period. So let's talk about average daily gains for your treatments.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we looked at the performance of these calves, a few measurements that we really wanted to look at was how are they growing? What is their body weight dimensions and things along those lines? And then how were they eating on
Hmm.
this and ultimately what the feed efficiency was. So we did see some linear increases in body weight. And so our pooled body weight over that period, it's not necessarily an end weight or a finished weight, but we increased linearly the body weight of those calves that had been receiving the substituted high protein corn product diet by about 6 pounds over that
Mm-hmm.
period. So that's a pretty big increase when you
Yes.
think about calves at this age and stage.
So not insignificant whatsoever. And I did find a really interesting discussion in your literature review about cited work from 2005. Xanten and Heinrich, you referenced their work about the relationship between the first lactation animals and the elevated average daily gain. Can you delve into that historical reference a little bit more? Because I anticipate most of my listeners probably are rearing heifers or replacement heifers and considering this for that class of animals. What do they need to be looking at and watching for if they choose to feed this product?
Yeah, so Xanten Heinrichs and others around that time period, and you said mid 2005 or so. And that was a time period when we were just really starting to push accelerated calf feeding programs. So getting these calves more milk during that early phase of life and trying to drive growth as much as possible instead of trying to force them to consume more dry feed because it was cheaper. And what we saw during those initial studies, looking at that, was if we got our calves to grow more during this early life period, it results in greater milk production as a cow, which makes sense. There's some developmental programming that's going on
Hmm.
during this early stage in life. With that, we would expect that in this early stage in life, that if we can get these heifers to grow a little bit more, hopefully that will translate into a little bit more milk production. Now, we have to have a caveat there, and what I stress in my dairy science courses for both dairy nutrition and dairy cattle management is we got to get these early life heifers off to a great start for the first 2 to 3 months of age.
Hmm.
We can start getting them pretty fat pretty quickly after that point as well. And so
Hmm.
then we have to have lean growth at the same time. So in this early stage that we were looking at, yes, we're probably still okay to be driving such high rates of growth. But moving on in, 3, 4, 5 months of age, we might need to be a little bit more cautious about that too.
Yeah, it's definitely a consideration. So, kind of in that same realm, there was some discussion about insulin. What did you see with insulin, and what do you think's happening there inside the animal?
Yeah, so we were able to take some blood samples from these calves on an every other week basis. And I love taking these types of samples because it tells us what's going on in the metabolism of the animals. And not only how are
Hmm.
they, we can see how they're taking in the nutrients, but what are they doing with those nutrients and how are they supplying these nutrients to the tissues within the body. And one of the big things that we noticed was that insulin concentrations were greater on these calves receiving the 100% high protein corn product diet in replacement of the soybean meal. And I saw something somewhat similar with glucose concentrations as well.
Hmm.
And so, this is kind of telling us a little bit that at least for our study design, what we were doing, I think was probably driven by the increased digestibility. They were absorbing more nutrients,
Hmm.
and we might have been at a high point where we were providing these calves a lot of energy And so they were maybe getting a little bit insulin resistant or needing some extra help to get those nutrients into the tissues of the body. So we didn't have any forage in this diet. It's just starter grains. And so we were really driving a lot of energy into these calves at this point in time. And it may have been reaching a point where it was exceeding what their actual nutrient demands were at that point in time.
Well, I like Snicker bars too, so no judgment, right? And so
Exactly.
just to kind of reiterate a little bit there, so did you offer any free choice access to hay during this period?
We did not offer any hay during this period. I recognize that a lot of people start to add a little bit of forage, maybe 5% forage at this stage, and that's great. I think you should do that. But for the purpose of our project, it's a little bit difficult. So
Sure thing. And so did they have free choice access or did you limit feed this amount of grain?
they were fed ad libitum, and so I think that's part of it too. They were able to consume as much as they wanted, and because it was a grain, there probably wasn't a lot of gut fill or rumen fill in this instance. So they were really able to chow down on as much as they wanted.
Yeah. Okay, so can you talk a little bit about what the concentration of crude protein is for these research rations?
This was in a diet that had crude protein of 23 to
Mm-hmm.
24%. So pretty high. And that's somewhat typical of calf starter grains, but
Right.
we were going to be looking at maybe a calf starter grain that is lower. Maybe we're on a big calf ranch in Western Kansas or something like
Mm.
that, where
Mm-hmm.
they're trying to control a few more costs and maybe running an 18% crude protein
Yes.
starter grain diet. Our results might be a little bit different. I think it's interesting and intriguing. We had great digestibility that tells us that this is available,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be another one of our next steps of can we pull down the crude protein concentration in these diets
Mm-hmm.
to make them maybe a little bit more cheap? And do we get the same responses?
One thing I kind of noticed you added the calves in June and August, and I know there wasn't any discussion about heat stress or seasonality. Could that have had any impact whatsoever on your observations?
So we blocked our animals associated with the calving date. And so that would have been accounted for within our statistical models and should have been controlled for. But I will say, from an observational standpoint, my graduate student, Rachel, who was working on this, did a fantastic job with this project. But she's like, man, those calves in the fall in
Mm-hmm.
October ate so much more than our
Sure.
calves that were weaned in August and September. And keep in mind, when we were doing this study, God bless her. She is
Uh-huh.
from Wisconsin and a great person. But we had a hot summer that summer in
Oh.
Manhattan, Kansas, hit the all-time high temperature at
Oh.
115 degrees one day during this project, and it was actually the hottest place within the continental United States on
Wow.
that day.
Bless her heart.
And so these cats really went through a lot. Our Wisconsin grad student really went through a lot as well. But they were able to keep plowing through. We never had any death loss with this study. Our
Awesome.
farm does a great job with that. But all of those seasonal effects should be accounted for, at least in our statistical model, to kind of help weed that out a little bit.
Perfect. I wasn't trying to punch holes in your project whatsoever. I just
No,
was
not at
wondering
all.
because sometimes
No, it's a
that heat does impact dry matter intake, and I
oh
noticed
yeah.
your dry matter intakes were beautiful, right? Talk about how they changed based on inclusion rates.
For our dry matter intake, there was an overall interaction between sex and treatment on dry matter intake. I mean, that gets a little bit complicated to explain in this form, but I think one of the more important things to look at was that we looked at overall linear increases or changes across treatment. And so as we included more high protein corn co-products in our diets, there was a tendency that calves would increase their dry matter intake of the starter grain as we increase that high protein corn product. And I think a lot of that likely is driven by the increased digestibility, which
Hmm.
allowed for greater gain of those calves and continued to drive more dry matter intake.
Yeah, and so as you saw dry matter intake increase, you also saw those rate of gains increase. And so efficiency was kind of the same across the board. I do think it's noteworthy
Yeah,
to see that there in figure four, your feed efficiency is pretty well the same across the board, right? And
right.
so,
Yeah.
well, very good. And then I guess more of a logistical question. Do you think this product will pellet well, or would you recommend it be included more in a meal?
That's a great question. And so when we were preparing for the project, we were actually anticipating that it would be in a meal form, similar to what soybean meal would be.
Hmm.
And it actually came in a very small pellet.
Hmm.
perform. And so that kind of surprised us. And we did some things to regrind that to have similar particle size as what the soybean meal would, because we didn't want differences because of
Mm,
particle size in the overall diet.
hmm
So it's reground then again. And so the protein sources were actually not in a pellet. They were kind of free flow within that calf starter grain.
hmm
So it did seem to pellet pretty well and seemed to be pretty stable in that pellet, at least in the bags when we were looking at that. But there were no fines in the bag and things like that. So
Awesome.
I think it would do pretty good.
Good. And that'll certainly help with shrink for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, so do you want to go into any discussion about the yeast product? I know we kind of started the conversation and you were saying that you can add back the yeast and your rations here, you have very healthy animals, low rates of loose manure, but in the grand scheme of things, do you think that that was an effect of the yeast or
I think that is a great thing to cover
okay.
because I think that's the next question of
Uh-huh.
why, the
Sure.
whys that we're seeing here. And we know that feeding yeast to ruminants has these magical effects that we're not totally sure what's going on. And so that raises the question to me, they put a lot of yeast bodies in this product, probably a little bit more compared to what's been seen in the past. And,
hmm
and Rachel did a good job in this paper of kind of summarizing some other studies where they've included
Yes.
yeast byproducts in calf starter grains, and they saw some variable results. But in general, we kind of think that those things are good for ruminal health and good for performance. So to me, I think that's probably the next thing if I was going to pursue this product a little bit more or the benefits here, is there a way that we can kind of isolate that with and without yeast bodies maybe and really understand if that's what's driving a lot of these really positive responses because those yeast bodies, the protein in that would be very digestible. I
hmm
think that's part of it as well and the digestibility effects that we did see. But there's probably some positive ruminal function benefits as a result of that as well that could be interesting to tease out.
Okay, so pardon my ignorance, but if you could expand a little bit more on how does the yeast get in there? Let's talk about ethanol production because we've all fed these byproducts. What's the process to generate these things?
Absolutely. Well, we can talk about it in the context of ethanol production or beer production. The same concept in both situations, right? And so yeast are small microorganisms, one-celled microorganisms that ferment a product anaerobically. And in this case, they're going to be fermenting the starch in corn to make ethanol for fuel production. And so we're going to add those yeast to in the ethanol plant to these giant vats that's mixed with corn mash and held at a warm temperature so they can proliferate and grow and ferment that starch and convert that starch to ethanol. When that process is done, centrifugation, the yeast are going to be in the liquid phase and they'll centrifuge that out and capture those yeast in that liquid portion so they can isolate those to put them back in product.
That's fantastic. Very good. Thank you for that little narrative because for years and years we've been feeding byproducts of the ethanol industry and maybe now we can understand and visualize that a little bit better. My favorite question to ask every author every month is you've got a room full of listeners, boots on the ground dairymen. What would you like them to take home from this very informative project?
The thing to me that's most important is that there is another tool out there for your toolbox. I think this probably performs well in calf starter grains that have a high percentage crude protein. And if the math is right for feeding this economically, it could fit into your calf starter grains. And obviously, that's going to flex up and down depending on a lot of different factors. And I think that's exciting that you can work with a nutritionist to kind of figure that out.
hmm Yeah, that magical break even and moment, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, we always have to do that on a dairy farm and make those
Yeah.
cost comparisons. At the time that we were writing this project and getting funding from this project from the Kansas Corn Commission, the high protein corn product Max was trading at about $5 per ton less than what soybean meal would be. So
Yeah.
there's a little bit of an advantage there.
hmm
But in our study, we added rumen protected amino acids, right? So there's a trade-off.
Cost to
Those are a
that.
little bit
Yeah.
more expensive.
hmm
So if we did kind of analysis based upon those numbers, even though we were adding amino acids to the 100% high protein corn product diet, it was still going to be a few cents less per calf per day
Hmm.
to feed that than a traditional soybean diet.
Yeah.
So there are some considerations in there, and we just have to kind of balance those as the market
Yeah.
trends.
Have a sharp pencil. Well, Dr. Brown, this has been a great discussion, and I thank you so much for your time. And listeners, I applaud you for taking time out of your day today to learn about this high protein corn co-product. I've really enjoyed our conversation and have learned a lot. This has been the May edition of the Dairy Science Digest, which is a monthly podcast project designed to bring the Journal of Dairy Science straight to your ears. We highlight peer-reviewed research articles actively in press because this is sound science that you can base your management decisions around, and it's provided to you by your University of Missouri Dairy team. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to get future editions straight to your cell phone. This is Reagan Bluel with the Dairy Science Digest, and I hope you have a great day.